Over the last 2 years, Saudi Arabia and the UAE quietly launched one of the most ambitious technology projects on the planet. Not a new weapon system, not a new oil field, but a bid to become a third pole of AI compute alongside the United States and China. We're recording this in early April 2026, just days after fresh reporting on Iran-linked attacks and threats against Gulf data centers, including facilities tied to Western hyperscalers and regional AI firms. On paper, this is about diversifying their economies. In reality, it is about parking critical AI infrastructure, chips, data, and models inside missile and drone range of Iran and asking the world to depend on it. Today, I'm going to strip away the slogans and focus on four things. What's actually being built in the Gulf, who controls it, and how that maps to their power profile, what Iran's current and future leadership mean for putting AI clusters in a live conflict zone, and what US policy and media are still missing about power, water, and data in this new landscape. For 50 years, Gulf power was simple: oil, gas, and security deals. If they turned the taps or shifted production, energy prices moved, and governments in Washington, Beijing, and Brussels felt it. Now, senior Saudi and Emirati officials are talking about something different. In the future, we will export data instead of oil. But what does that actually mean? It means building hyperscale data centers, football field size facilities full of racks, cables, and high-end chips at a scale we've never seen in the region. Saudi Arabia's new data center strategy targets roughly 1.3 to 1.5 gigawatts of capacity by 2030, which would put it in the same league as major European markets. The UAE is doing something similar with projects like G42's mega campuses and joint ventures with global partners, including a planned multi-gigawatt Stargate complex marketed as a regional AI hub. These are not just warehouses for photos and spreadsheets. They are designed to host top-tier AI accelerators, NVIDIA-class chips, and competing designs, and to run training and inference for models that will power everything from a search and translation to logistics, defense analytics, and autonomous systems. If this is built out and stays on track, by the early 2030s, a non-trivial share of the AI services you use, directly or indirectly, could be running on compute physically located in the Gulf, just as a huge share of your fuel once came from its oil fields. Consider that for a second. Now, let's get more concrete. A single state-of-the-art AI data center can draw 100 to 300 megawatts of power, with plans in the Gulf pointing towards clusters that add up to gigawatts. That's like bolting a mid-sized city's worth of electricity demand onto a grid that already supports energy-intensive desalination, heavy industry, and cooling. Inside those buildings, you have chips, tens or hundreds of thousands of AI accelerators ordered in bulk from US vendors like NVIDIA and AMD, with Chinese firms pushing for footholds wherever export controls leave room. Storage and networking, petabytes of data and high-speed fiber linking these sites to Europe, Asia, and Africa. Power and backup, high voltage connections, substations, and diesel or gas generators that keep things running through outages. Cooling, which is where the Gulf becomes uniquely challenged. In a place where the summer temperatures regularly hit 45 to 50 degrees Celsius, conventional air and evaporative cooling chew through both electricity and water. Desalinated water is already a critical resource in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Adding water-intensive data centers on top of agriculture, households, and industry raises hard questions. Some operators are shifting to more efficient designs. Liquid cooling, rear door heat exchangers, and immersion systems that can cut water usage dramatically and improve energy efficiency. But these are not yet universal, and they require high quality power and engineering talent to run. So when you hear we will export data instead of oil, understand the trade. They are trying to convert hydrocarbon and solar energy plus scarce water and land into an infrastructure platform that other countries' AI models will depend on. This is not a side hustle. It's a bid to make the Gulf a permanent node in the AI supply chain, the way it has been a permanent node in oil and gas. Now, who actually controls this infrastructure? We tend to talk as if these are just business deals between Western tech firms and Gulf investors. But control sits on several layers. First, physical and legal control. The land, buildings, and power are under sovereign Gulf jurisdiction. Local regulators decide on data localization, security standards, and what can or cannot be hosted, including politically sensitive workloads. Second, hardware supply. Most of the cutting-edge AI chips still come from U.S. firms, manufactured through complex global supply chains that Washington now guards with export controls, especially when it comes to China. That gives the U.S. leverage, but it also ties American firms and allies into whatever political bargains underpin these Gulf projects. Third, data and models. Some workloads will be strictly local, Saudi and the Emirati government systems, national AI projects, regional firms. Others will be global, Western hyperscalers placing capacity in the Gulf to serve customers in Africa, South Asia, and Europe more cheaply and redundantly. If Saudi Arabia and the UAE succeed, they don't just get rental income. They become gatekeepers and guarantors for a chunk of global AI capacity, with the ability to shape what runs, who gets access, and under what conditions. That shifts their bargaining position from both Washington and Beijing. Instead of buy our oil, sell us weapons, we host your bases, the conversation becomes we host data and compute your companies and militaries rely on. You still want access to our energy, but now you also need our participation in your digital and AI strategies. This is deliberate. It's how you pivot from being an extractive supplier at the start of the chain to a structural player in the middle of it. To really understand how this plays out under pressure, we need to look at these leaders, how they derive power, not just what hardware they buy. I use a framework called CPP. CPP maps power derivation along three axes. First, intrinsicus versus extrinsicus. Do you derive power mainly from yourself, personal vision, charisma, inner narrative, or from institutions, the office, the hierarchy, parties, security apparatus? Another axis is the egoistic intensity. How much of it is self over others? Then we have the altruistic intensity. How much do you balance self with others and reason trade-offs? CPP predicts a simple but uncomfortable pattern. At the extremes, very intrinsicus or very extrinsicus, egoism tends to be high, leaders become rigid and self-serving in different ways, but change and implementation can be made quickly. Near the center, where internal agency and institutions are balanced, altruism peaks. Leaders are more likely to make pragmatic, evidence-based trade-offs, but change and implementation become slower and more bureaucratic. Let's take a look at our key actors. First, we have Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, of Saudi Arabia. His power clearly has strong intrinsicus component. Vision 2030 is his personal project. He has centralized decision making. His image is tied to the country's transformation. At the same time, he is building and leaning on institutions. SDAIA, the Public Investment Fund, a national data center strategy to scale and legitimize his vision. On the CPP map that looks like moderate intrinsicus with rising altruism, he still derives a lot from himself, but increasingly uses structures and alliances to make it work. Next, we have Mohammed bin Zayed, MBZ of the UAE. MBZ's style is more extrinsicus leaning. He builds and operates through systems, sovereign funds, security services, firms like G42 and Kazna, and his power flows through those networks. Yet, he often shows high altruism, managing multiple alliances, investing in long-term projects, hedging between great powers while avoiding reckless shocks. That is moderate extrinsicus with relatively high altruism. Institutional leverage plus a habit of balancing risks and benefits. Now we go to Iran. Iran's current leadership cluster, Supreme Leader and the IRGC, your power is overwhelmingly extrinsicus. It lives in the revolutionary institutions, the security apparatus, and the legal architecture of the Islamic Republic. CPP flags this cluster as very close to extreme extrinsicus, high egoism, low altruism. The system's needs, survival, and ideologically narrative dominate. Collateral damage and external costs are heavily discounted. That has real implications. CPP predicts that in this quadrant, leaders are much more willing to treat infrastructure, even civilian or dual use, as a legitimate tool of coercion, especially when they see it as part of an adversary's power. Recent reporting that Iran and its proxies have targeted or threatened data centers and AI infrastructure in the Gulf, including facilities linked to the US, cloud providers, and regional partners, is exactly the kind of behavior that this pattern anticipates. Now imagine leadership change in Iran. A post-Khomeini era could produce a more bureaucratic, conservative, still extrinsicus, but slightly more moderate, making infrastructure pressure more calibrated and predictable, or a charismatic nationalist populist, more intrinsicus, tying legitimacy to bold standoffs and high visibility strikes. In both cases, unless altruism rises and they move toward the CPP center, the temptation to put data centers and digital infrastructure at risk remains. The hardware is new. The motivational geometry underneath is not. Now let's put the pieces together. You are building a multi-gigawatt clusters of AI compute in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Some of it tied to the US and allied firms. within range of Iranian missiles and drones that have already been used against energy infrastructure, shipping, and now digital targets. From a strategic perspective, that does three things at once. First, it creates leverage for the Gulf states. If global firms and governments rely on Gulf-based data centers for AI and cloud services, outright war becomes more costly for everyone. Shutting down or damaging those facilities would disrupt not just local networks, but potentially services used in Europe, Asia, and the US. Second, it creates a new category of high-value targets for Iran. From Tehran's extreme extrinsic vantage point, these sites are not neutral. They are visible symbols of Western-aligned digital power, sitting on territory already entwined with U.S. security guarantees and bases. CPP predicts that such leadership will see pressuring or hitting these nodes as a way to erode U.S. and Gulf leverage without closing the Strait of Hormuz. Treat cyber and physical attacks on data infrastructure as a scalable tool, something between a symbolic strike and an economic weapon. We are already seeing hints of this in reported cyber operations, drone activity, and messaging around foreign digital bases in the region. Third, it forces the U.S. and allies into a more complex deterrence game. It is one thing to protect oil fields and tankers. It's another to protect globally connected AI clusters where damage can ripple through civilian services far beyond the region. In a crisis, policymakers would have to weigh how hard it is to signal that data centers are off limits, how much redundancy they have elsewhere, and whether to risk escalation to defend infrastructure that serves both commercial and strategic functions. None of that is currently front and center in public debate. So far, we have talked about chips and missiles. We should talk about electricity and water, because they quietly govern how far this can go. On power, the Gulf has a structural advantage. Abundant hydrocarbons and rapidly expanding solar capacity give Saudi Arabia and the UAE the raw energy to feed power-hungry AI campuses. But grid stability, transmission, and the opportunity cost of diverting gigawatts into data centers are real constraints, especially as populations grow and industry electrifies. On water and cooling, traditional cooling can consume millions of liters of water per day at large facilities in regions already among the most water stressed on Earth. Desalination plants themselves consume significant power, meaning that water for cooling indirectly burns more fuel or uses more renewable capacity. Analysts and regional experts have warned that unless new Gulf data centers adopt more efficient cooling and wastewater reuse, they risk straining water and energy systems and provoking environmental and political blowback. Advanced liquid and immersion cooling can reduce water use significantly and improve energy efficiency, but retrofitting and scaling these systems across the entire build-out takes time and money. From a CPP perspective, this is where leadership style matters again. MBS and MBZ, operating in moderate intrinsicus and moderate extrinsicus zones with rising altruism, have incentives to invest in long-term resilience, diversified power sources, efficient cooling, and hardened distributed designs, because their legitimacy is tied to being seen as both modernizers and stewards. Iran's current leadership at extreme extrinsicus has incentives to exploit these physical vulnerabilities, not help manage them. targeting power lines, desal links, or single point of failure sites to maximize leverage at relatively low cost. So the gamble is this. The Gulf is betting that it can turn energy and water into AI power fast enough, sustainably enough, and safely enough that the rest of the world accepts the risk of tying its digital future to infrastructure in a tense neighborhood. If they win that bet, their power multiplies. If they lose through miscalculation, environmental strain, or conflict, the backlash will not be limited to the region. Here's where US policy and Western media are still behind the curve. Coverage and debate still frame Gulf stories mostly as arms deals and base access, oil production decisions and OPEC spats, human rights, tourism projects, and occasional tech investments. All of those matter. But if you look at what is being financed and built, the strategic heart of the next 2 decades is shifting towards digital infrastructure, data centers, fiber routes, chip flows, and AI research ecosystems anchored in Gulf capitals. A few policy questions follow, and they are barely being asked in public. First, what are the red lines and expectations around hosting critical AI clusters within range of adversary missiles? Should there be agreed principles, at least among allies, on how redundant those systems must be or where they can sit? Second, how do export controls and security guarantees adapt when your own firm's AI capacity depends on infrastructure in countries that are also hedging between you and your competitors? You see this already in the debates over US chip exports, Chinese investment in Gulf AI firms, and the role of companies like G42 in bridging ecosystems. Third, how do water and energy policy enter the equation? If US and European companies rely heavily on the Gulf data centers, they have a stake in how sustainably and safely those data centers manage power and water, and whether local politics can sustain those trade-offs under stress. Right now, most Western narratives compress all this into big funding round in Riyadh, UAE signs cloud deal, Iran threatens Gulf assets without connecting dots to your daily AI tools and long-term systems risk. We are still talking about the Gulf with a 2003 vocabulary, oil bases arms, while the architecture of the 2035 power is being poured in concrete and steel around AI campuses. Let's sketch 3 plausible lanes for where this could go. Scenario 1, stable leverage. In this lane, Saudi Arabia and the UAE successfully build out multi-gigawatt efficient and relatively hardened AI infrastructure. MBS and MBZ continue to drift towards the CPP center with higher altruism, still assertive, but increasingly pragmatic, balancing domestic, Western, and Asian interests. Iran's leadership remains aggressive but sees data centers as too costly to hit directly, using threats and cyber pressure more than kinetic strikes. The result? It's messy, but it's manageable. The Gulf becomes a critical but reasonably stable node of global AI compute, buying the region and its partners more leverage, but not triggering systemic shocks. Scenario 2, fragile concentration. In this scenario, the infrastructure build-out races ahead of the water and power and resilience planning. Cooling remains water intensive, Grid strain, local backlash, and environmental stress rise. Leadership in Saudi Arabia or the UAE leans harder into egoistic narratives, prestige projects, speed over safety, without matching investments in redundancy. In that world, even modest Iranian pressure, cyber attacks, threats to critical nodes, or limited strike could force global firms to rethink their dependence on Gulf data centers, triggering rapid shifts in investment and architecture. Scenario 3, shock and realignment. In the shock lane, either an Iranian leadership transition produces a bolder, more risk-tolerant actor, or a crisis escalates faster than expected, perhaps tied to a separate conflict or misread signals. A major Gulf data center cluster is damaged by cyber attack, sabotage, or a kinetic strike, and services relying on that cluster degrade or go offline across multiple regions. Even if redundancy limits the outage, the psychological effect is huge. Suddenly, the world sees AI infrastructure in the Gulf as a high-risk, single point of failure, and capital rushes to distribute compute more widely. In CPP terms, this is what happens when extreme extrinsic egoism in Tehran collides with a still maturing, ambitious, but not fully centered leadership in Riyadh or Abu Dhabi. The long run effect would be to rewire where and how AI is hosted and to reset how much marginal power the Gulf derives from being that third pole. Hold those three words in your mind. They are the lanes we're drifting between. Before we close, a quick method note. I'm not asking you to trust me because this sounds dramatic, or trust Gulf leaders, or Iranian leaders, or any single analyst. The lens I'm using asks three questions. What is actually being built? Not headlines, but gigawatts of power, megawatts of cooling, numbers of chips, kilometers of fiber, and legal regimes that govern data. Who derives power from it and how? Using CPP to map whether leaders are pulling power mainly from within themselves, from institutions, or from a balanced center, and what that predicts about how they treat critical infrastructure under stress. How robust is that configuration under real-world shocks? War with Iran, leadership transitions, water shortages, blackouts, new export control. Do these systems bend or do they break? Where the data is solid, build out plans, power, and water numbers, documented attacks, I lean on them. Where we're in a scenario territory, leadership trajectories, crisis behavior, I flag the assumptions and use frameworks that at least map the direction of risk. The point is not to say trust this one model. It is to replace trust me, I have a hot take, with here's what's being poured in concrete, here's who empowers it, and here's how this might behave when things go wrong. So where does that leave us? 4 decades, the Gulf's power story was simple. Oil and gas out, money and weapons in. U.S. protection at the top. That story is still true. But layered on top of it is a new one. AI infrastructure, data centers, chips, and cooling systems that could make Saudi Arabia and the UAE a third pole of global compute, right in Iran's neighborhood. If they succeed, every major power that cares about AI, which is to say, every major power, will have to factor in Gulf infrastructure into its strategy the way it once had to factor in Gulf oil into its energy map. If they stumble through technical overreach, environmental limits, or conflict, the shock will be felt far beyond the desert. Moderate altruistic positions can turn this into durable shared leverage. Egoistic extremes on any side can turn it into another brittle vulnerability in an already fragile system. In future episodes, we'll zoom out further into how AI infrastructure, trade, and military posture knit together into a new map of who actually has room to move in the 2030s. For now, when you see stories about Gulf arms deals, Iranian threats, or AI hype, add, add three questions. Where are the data centers in this story? Who controls them legally and physically? And what happens if someone decides they're fair game? That's where a lot of the real story is quietly being written. I'm Dr. Curt Rasmussen. This is Global Power Shifts. I'll see you at episode 5.